it's my honor and my privilege to introduce our very own international water warrior. She is the Honorary Chair of the Council of Canadians and chairs the board of the Washington-based Food and Water Watch. She serves on the executive of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and is a counselor with the Hamburg-based World Future Council. Our distinguished speaker is the recipient of 14 honorary doctorates, as well as many awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, which is considered the alternative Nobel, the Lannan Foundation Cultural Freedom Fellowship Award, the Citation for Lifetime Achievement at the Canadian Environmental Awards, the Earth Day Canada Outstanding Environmental Achievement Award, the Planet in Focus Eco Hero Award, and the Earth Care Award, which is the highest international honor of the Sierra Club. She has served as senior advisor on water to the 63rd President of the United Nations and is a leader in the campaign to have water recognized as a human right by the UN. She is the author of dozens of reports, as well as 18 books, including her latest, Blue Future, Protecting Water for People and the Planet Forever, and Boiling Point, Government Neglect, Corporate Abuse, and Canada's Water Crisis. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our one and only Maude Barlow.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's absolutely too much. I'm going to take that down from our website. Thank you, Ron, very much for such a beautiful introduction. Thank you to you and Lynn Grist for so much of the work tonight. Thank you, Mike, for your emceeing wherever you are. There you are. Arlene, for your not only your beautiful recognition of the sacred place we are occupying here tonight, but also what a surprise that you have such a gift of music. I didn't know this about you. I knew it about James, though, and your music is always beautiful. A big shout out to Susan and all the people at GETconcerned. It's just an absolutely amazing victory that you've done for all of us. I don't know if you know, but tonight was planned about the plant because at the time, I think a lot of people did believe that it's a done deal. So we were all here together, right, Susan, to say it's not a done deal. But when you guys won, I think the decision was, listen, hey, this water is still precious. There's still going to be people coming at it after it. So let's go. Donna in Elora, I don't know if you know that I was there at the very beginning when the Elora well was just a twinkle in Nestle's eyes. That's how long I've been fighting that damn company. And Doug, your strong remarks on the Quarry are just incredibly important because it's happening all over the province. And I have to tell you, I worry that what's going to happen now with the new Doug Ford administration, it's going to be, more and newer worry. I'm going to talk a wee bit about the global, just remind us the global situation we're in and about Canada and a little bit about Ontario and then what some of the things that we can be doing. There's a strange new phenomenon in Europe this summer. Europe was so stricken with drought that water tables are way down, and they're down to the lowest level in modern recorded history. There isn't anything in the history books. And there are what are called hunger stones that are beginning to sound a warning. Hunger stones are ancient boulders that traditionally sit far below the water table in the lakes and rivers. And they have inscriptions written on them from peoples who lived there hundreds of years ago. Basically, if the water goes down low enough that you can see the inscriptions, it was a warning that there would be drought because there would not, or famine, because there would not be enough water to allow a good harvest. One dating back to 1660 reads, "If you see me, weep." Another says, "If you will again see this stone, so you will weep. So shallow was the year 1417. Another said, we cried, and you will cry." I want to be a messenger of hope, and I am, but I think that we have to start with the place that we recognize that we have taken the world's water for granted. We haven't understood the message that we've heard here this evening, that it is a finite resource with a great deal of increased demand upon it. We have a global crisis. We are actually a planet running out of clean water, which is something we all learned back in grade 5 or 6 or whatever. Wasn't possible. We were taught about the great hydrologic cycle. You'll remember the drawings and the textbooks that showed the rain coming and the snow coming and so on, and the evaporation and so on. But we were right in learning that there was a finite amount of water and it couldn't go anywhere. But what we didn't understand is that we could pollute it, deplete it, divert it from where nature put it, and actually destroy local hydrologic cycles. And we're damming our rivers to death. Most major rivers in the world no longer reach the ocean. We're massively polluting lakes and rivers, and we're over-extracting groundwater at an amazing rate. And that's why it's so important that you've concentrated on the groundwater question here in this Guelph area. By 2030, says the UN, supply will only meet 60% of global demand. Now try to stop and think what we're talking about here. That means that 40% of the demand in the world will go unfulfilled. And that means, and who's that going to be? Well, right now we know who it is, and unless there's a dramatic change, it's going to be more of the same. It's going to be the poor of the world. It's going to be the migrants. It's going to be the people living in areas without water. And the UN says that a serious drought could affect as many as 7 billion people within 50 years. Within 50 years, 7 billion people could be living in areas of severe drought. Already, every year, 2 billion people are forced to drink dirty water, and 2.5 billion have no sanitation. I want to be very clear here. When we talk about climate change and water, we tend to hear, and this is my gentle criticism of the climate movement, is that we tend to hear that greenhouse gas emission induced climate creates problems for water, and that's true. There's evaporation. We know that the Great Lakes, actually there's a big study out today that says that the Great Lakes have risen in temperature by 3 degrees, and this is a very dramatic amount of rising warmth. And so we know that that's true, but that's not what I want to talk about. What I think is very important for us to understand is that when we pollute water, when we mismanage water, when we move it from where nature put it to where we want it to be, we actually are creating part of the climate crisis. The abuse of water is part of the climate crisis, and protecting water and restoring watersheds is one of the important ways that we can mitigate climate crisis. And it's really important that we look at pull-out water as a separate kind of concept. And it's also, to be clear, that it's not just in water-scarce area of the world. Africa, I have a colleague who's working in Cape Town as we speak, putting together round tables to get people involved in coming up with a solution. I mean, they're talking about ground zero, but it's only one of many places. 22 countries in Africa running out. Australia, the government finally said about a month ago, we are a country without water. We've got to stop talking about this as if it's cyclical drought. All of the Middle East is due to run out, literally within 40 to 50 years. Brazil never had drought in its history, but they cut down so much of the Amazon that the massive waves of what they call flying rivers, the streams of what what the rainforest gives off is basically flying rivers, and they float on clouds and come down in the south every year in massive amounts. No more. Brazil is facing a huge crisis. I was in one community where they showed me that they're actually digging wells or digging holes, boreholes in their basement to try to find water. China, since 1990, more than half the rivers in China, half the major rivers in China are gone. They don't know where they went, they're gone. The US, you take a look right through from Florida with their sinkholes to California, where they have diverted water more than anywhere else in the world, just, you know, crisscrossing pipelines and, and diversions, and just all to grow 80% of the world's almonds and so on. But Canada too, and this is what I guess I could spend the night talking about the climate issue and the international situation. But we in Canada have very serious problems about water, and this is something we need to face. We were taught what I call the myth of abundance when we were young, that we have so much water, we could do whatever we want with it. And so our history is replete with just dumping water, dumping pollution where we want to, not taking care of our water. We hear that we have 20% of the world's fresh water. That's only true if you were to drain every lake and river in the country. We actually have about 6.5% of the actual water that can be used without taking down the original stock, and it's in serious decline. Between climate change and our abuse, our lakes are warming. Canadian lakes are warming faster than any other lakes in the world, and Lake Superior, believe it or not, is warming at the very fastest. Our glaciers are melting, every single one of them. Our Arctic lakes are disappearing, and this is very important because what the scientists first saw when they were watching climate change in the Arctic, they would see in the spring great runoff, and they would think, oh, this is wonderful, all this water. But then they started to understand that the permafrost was melting, and that produced a lot of water while it was happening. But when the permafrost stopped melting, then those very shallow lakes started to dry up. We have no protection, very, very poor protection for our groundwater at a national level. Very little mapping. We don't know where we're overextending our groundwater. We have no national standards for drinking water. We have very poor standards, national standards for wastewater. Thanks, I'm good, Ron. And we're raising as in Z, not IS, our forests and our wetlands. Canada now leads the planet in degradation of untouched forests. We're dumping chemicals, sewage, herbicides, and pesticides into our waters and onto our lands. And do you know that we have no laws about animal runoff of these factory farms? We do have laws around human sewage, but we have no laws about factory farms. We are allowing massive amounts of eutrophication into our lakes. Fatal toxins in blue-green algae have been found in 246 major lakes in Canada. Lake Winnipeg is in crisis, as is Lake Erie, which we thought was well again, but of course, because we've allowed this massive runoff, more from the American side, but also from our side, Lake Erie is sick again. And we talked earlier about the crisis in First Nations. 2/3 of all First Nations communities have been under a drinking water advisory in the last decade. And you are 90% more likely to be living without running water in your home if you're living in an Indigenous community in this country. It continues to be a disgrace. And I have to say that I do give the Trudeau government credit for having recognized this and having started putting some decent money into it. But we have a long, long way to go. Now, what we're talking about here in Canada is, besides this myth of abundance, years and years, decades of government neglect and corporate abuse that we've just thought because we have so much water, it doesn't matter. Successive federal governments have not asserted their constitutional responsibility for Canada's water. The worst offender, although there were others, more neglect in other cases, the worst offender was the Harper government. Our organization's nonpartisan. We retain the right to be angry at any government of any political strength. They waged war on science and scientists, and they fired 2,000 scientists. Most of the aquatic scientists are gone. Hundreds of water and climate research projects, facilities, and institutes were slashed or closed. They have not been reconstructed. This is really important for us to understand. When something gets closed and it's a time of austerity, it often doesn't get started again. I remember talking to Robert Kennedy Jr. when he was with Riverkeepers, and he wrote a book about the last Bush administration before Clinton, and he talked about the hundreds and hundreds of laws and regulations protecting the environment that have been slashed. And I said, and how many did the Clinton administration bring back? He said, none, not one. Governments have fought those fights in the past, but it's very hard to get them back when they're gone. The Harper government stopped enforcing the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. In fact, there was a senior person there, the senior executive there left last year. Before he left, he put out a statement saying we were actually breaking the law. We were actually not going after and charging companies for criminal behavior of toxic pollution for fear of a political backlash. Then they brought in a loophole to the Fisheries Act, and that loophole was that a lake, a mining company could apply to the government to have a lake no longer termed a lake, but a tailings impoundment area. And so we fought bitterly against the first one. Well, we fought bitterly on the first two, was Fish Lake in British Columbia. We won that fight. But another one, a lovely lake called Sandy Pond, which wasn't a pond at all. It's a great big lake filled with fish in Newfoundland. We lost that fight, and it's a dead lake now. But there are a whole bunch of them that are now being destroyed under this loophole. But then they gutted the Fisheries Act, they gutted the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and they gutted the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. With these changes, federal protection of 99% of all our lakes and rivers in Canada was gone. That meant that pipelines carrying explosive bitumen or tar sands bitumen loaded with chemicals could now pass over, under, or around more than 31,000 lakes and 2.25 million rivers without federal scrutiny. Now, the Trudeau government promised when they were running that they would reinstate these laws, and they came back in the form of something called Bill C-69, which we've been very involved in, and you can go to our website and get all sorts of details. There are some improvements with the new fisheries provisions, but the new Canadian Navigable Waters Act was supposed to reinstate the protections the Harper government gutted. It did not, and this is very important for us to know. Instead, it set up two classes of lakes, those 1% that were protected under Harper's new law. And then there's another that the wording is extremely vague that that might impact public policy and so on. So it looks like we're going to have to look at each lake and river and each project separately, and it looks as if communities are going to be responsible for trying to re-enlist their watershed. As well, C-69 exempts pipelines and power lines from the Act. So projects such as Kinder Morgan, the pipeline which the government just bought, the people just bought, which will travel over 1,355 waterways, and large dams and current fracking operations are not subject to C-69. So it's not as bad as it was when Harper was in power, but it's not as good as it was promised. And certainly it doesn't step back and take a look at the whole issue. When Trudeau was running, again, he talked about having a minister of water, having a ministry of water where they would bring all the agencies and ministries together that are involved in water and really have a kind of a national perspective, a set of national regulations. That has not happened. And we really need to I know when we get involved in local politics or Ontario politics, and I go right across the country and I find this everywhere, people think about their provincial government as being responsible for everything, but there really are very important provisions and responsibilities that the federal government has. Then we have corporate abuse. It's very important for us to know that since the 1980s, when they were doing it through the 70s and 80s, governments were really promoting secondary manufacturing. So yes, we take down the trees and mine and so on and pull up the fish, but we would do secondary manufacturing here. And at that point, manufacturing accounted for about 26% of our GDP. Today, it's only 11% through globalization and trade agreements where we're not allowed to do that anymore. We've let that go. And so what happens is that we're going back to extractive industries. We're going back to being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and that's all we have. I mean, if you let your manufacturing go and you don't have a proper high-tech industry, you're going to go back to back to the land. And that's what's happening in Alberta. There are a lot of people who would rather not work in that industry. It's not a healthy industry. If you've ever stood on the banks of the the Syncruise site and smelled the smell of it, or seen the big ponds, the ponds full of poison, you realize that people would choose to do work somewhere else if they could. But what happens is that we've become very dependent again on manufacturing, less on manufacturing and on extractive industries. In the tar sands, 11 million liters of toxics are dumped into the waterways every single day. We have, of course, the pipeline threats that you know about for Kinder Morgan. What people don't know is that the Great Lakes are already a carbon corridor. For the worst of this bitumen, there are already huge pipelines. Line 6, Line 3 is going to be developed now. These are pipelines that go to Superior, Wisconsin, and then are shipped by rail and barges even on the Great Lakes, taking tar sands oil from Canada. So it's not as if this is a new thing. And even if we're able to stop the Keystone pipeline, we still are sending an amazing amount over, around, and even under the Great Lakes, and it's a real threat. We have fracking frenzies in BC and Alberta, a very, very serious threat to the water there. We have increased mining right across the country. We're dumping heavy metals and toxic waste into our waters. And we even have a return to the debate about exporting our raw water, which some of you, if you've been around the debate around the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, you'll remember was a big part of those issues. And trade and investment agreements such as NAFTA, which is being renegotiated right now, CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Europe, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now being soon to be ratified, they all threaten water because in all cases they cement in the concept that water is a tradable good. That's how I first got involved in this. Way back in 1985, I was reading the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and I noticed that in the list of what goods were included, what was included under the definition of good, which means governments aren't supposed to stop the trade in these goods, along with cars and shoes and everything else like that, was water in all its forms, including ice and snow, which stunned me. I couldn't understand how water could be a tradable good, and that's what started me on this journey. So it's still very much alive and of an issue. When CETA, the European agreement, is finalized, and it's not yet, and the provision for corporations to be allowed to sue, which is in NAFTA now, if that gets adopted, which we've stopped it so far, but we're in a big fight, and the government, future government of Ontario, even this government dream along, were to say, we're going to kick the bottled water companies out, Nestle could sue under these provisions of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, not only for the money they're losing now, but for all future profits until the end of their contracts. Now, Ontario, what's the situation? Well, we have some good legislation. We've got the Clean Water Act, which came out of the Walkerton tragedy. We've managed to stop any serious talk of a fracking industry here, which is good. But you know that we have many related problems related to urban sprawl, poor enforcement of water protection rules, and inadequate agricultural regulations and practices, such as the growth in factory farms that are causing soil destruction and nutrient overloading of our lakes. Ontario is the only province that does not require an environmental assessment before a mine is developed, and we are dealing with thousands of abandoned mine sites that are leaching into our waterways. We have the worst legislation, the poorest regulation of any province in the country. The proposed Ring of Fire plan for Northern Ontario will affect 5,000 square acres of now untouched forests that protect a vast reservoir of clean water. And then, of course, there's the fight against Nestle. Do you know that globally this year, the bottled water industry produced and sold 465 billion liters of bottled water, and most of it in plastic. I was on Air Canada coming here today, and I noted a new thing in Air Canada. Always in business class, they have the bottled water, but in the economy class, they have the carts with the water from a pitcher. I was in Economy today and noted that they're handing out little bottles of water, little Air Canada bottles of water. And when they collected the garbage, they did not collect it separately for recycling. They dumped it in with all the other garbage that they were collecting. So there we are, knowing that our rivers and our lakes and our oceans are in crisis with water, and we are set to dramatically increase that amount of plastic. Nestle will be extracting, as I don't need to tell you guys, more than 6 billion liters a day at its 3 wells when Middlebrook gets going. The company has drawn down more than 1 billion liters at its Aberfoyle well since its license expired just over 2 years ago. Yes, the province is charging more now for this raw water, but it still only amounts to 1/20th of a penny for every liter that Nestle pumps and sells. Between 2011 and 2015, the aquifer that supplies the main Nestle well dropped about 1.5 meters, while Nestle's water takings increased 33%. This is insanity. This is wrong. A 2016 City of Guelph report found that Nestle poses a threat to the city's drinking water security, and this area is growing. I've been coming to this area for many years now, and it's growing. That water is needed for other than supplying profits to a transnational that doesn't need it. I mean, Nestle, its bottled water, its big division, earns $92 billion every year. That's their profits. Its bottled water division takes a profit of about $9 billion every year. I mean, all we're doing is taking this beautiful water and handing it over. And it's Middlebrook sits on the traditional territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River, 90% of whom do not have running water in their homes. So it's appalling that with this global water crisis and the crisis of plastic in our oceans, that Nestle, a transnational that, as I say, has annual profits of over $92 billion, can bottle this precious water, ship it thousands of kilometers away, and get even richer. We absolutely have to say no. We have to stay clear in our opposition to Nestle. And we ask anyone who hasn't joined the boycott to go to our website, and please do. At the national level, we are demanding, and as I say, during the election, Trudeau made huge promises. We are demanding strong national plan of action with strong federal leadership in cooperation with the provinces, because it's a shared responsibility. And communities and First Nations. We need clear protections for groundwater. It boggles my mind. I go to Europe and a lot, and I see the protections there. In Munich, in that part of Germany, they actually have a law that the water that comes through the tap has to be clean enough to give to a baby. And so and it's a law, and they mean it. And so every farm, every company along the way of that watershed is responsible for not polluting it. You can go swimming in Lake Zurich with the city around it. I mean, you're swimming in this pristine water, and there's the city, because they care about it and because they brought in laws. In the year 2000, they brought in a European-wide law of watershed protection. So they said when a river crosses into or a lake crosses into my territory, we're not saying that's where my responsibility starts and yours ends. No, we're going to bring in legislation and rules and regulations on a watershed basis. And they have citizens committees that are made up of elected representatives and elected citizens to manage water on a regional basis. Miracle stories of water recovery, because as Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great romantic poet, said, there is a deep dearness down in nature. It will come back if we will stop hurting it. We need national drinking water and wastewater standards. We need a ban on new pipelines and fracking. We need a removal of water from all trade agreements. And we need justice for First Nations. It is past time for us to abandon our erroneous belief that Canada has unlimited supplies of water, that Canadians have taken care of our water, or that we still have lots of time to do so. All of those are wrong. The path forward for me is clear, perhaps not simple, but clear. We need what I call a new water ethic. And that is that everything we do must ask the question, what's the impact on water? And when we grow biofuels, because we want to cut down on gasoline use, fossil fuel use, we destroy water. In the US, they've turned the Ogallala Aquifer into one massive corn operation, almost all industrial. And it takes 1,700 liters of water to produce 1 liter of corn ethanol. It's not a good enough trade-off. We need to ask the question when we're trading, what is the impact? This shirt comes from this country, and the same shirt is made in a different factory in this country. In this country, they're destroying the last of their water to make that shirt. In this country, not yet. Have we any way of assessing that? Have we any way of asking on these trade agreements, what's the impact of water here in Canada? The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Europe, we've agreed to dramatically increase pork and beef exports to Europe. Alberta doesn't have enough water to be producing more beef. And much of the hog farms around Lake Winnipeg that are destroying Lake Winnipeg would be beefed up or porked up to produce the exports to Europe. We need to start asking these questions if we have the facility to be able to move forward. And this ethic must be based on the principles of water justice, water sustainability, and public trust. There is no way to protect water or the human right to water, and that's been a fight that I've been involved with for many years, unless we maintain water in the public trust. That is, that it is part of our commons, it belongs to all, it belongs to the ecosystem, it belongs to the future, it is not just something for our profit and pleasure. Water is the common heritage of all people and future generations and must be preserved as a public trust in law for all time. And it's also the most important element of an ecosystem that gives us life. Watersheds must be protected and restored. Just quickly, and I know I need to stop in a couple of minutes, I want to tell you the exciting news of this project called Blue Communities. And a blue community is something we and the Canadian Union of Public Employees started in Canada 10 years ago this fall, when Harper was basically saying to municipalities that wanted to build more water infrastructure, if you want or need federal funding, you have to go to a public-private partnership. So we brought in this concept of blue communities to get municipalities to agree to protect and promote water as a human right, to protect water as a public trust, therefore no privatization, and to promote their public water, clean, safe public water over bottled water, and to eventually do away with bottled water on municipal sites and council meetings and so on. And we now have 19 cities in Canada that have gone blue, and now it's spreading to Europe. There's actually a whole project in Switzerland, which is the home of Nestle, so I kind of think that they've done that on purpose. But the city of Bern has become a blue community, the major university in Bern, a number of other universities, some of the labor unions. It's a very, very exciting project. And I'm going in October, I'm going to Germany, where Berlin, Munich, Augsburg, and Marburg, 4 cities, are becoming blue communities. Paris, after 10 years ago, took their water back into public management. It had been privatized for years, and it was a huge fight with Veolia and Suez, the 2 big companies that were running the water system. They became a blue community because they said, it's more than just taking it back. We need to make a statement that water belongs to us all, and it belongs to our children, it belongs to 7 generations beyond, and we need to protect it. So I'm very excited about this because I think I have this dream of the world kind of turning blue a piece at a time. It's extraordinarily important. Just last thought for you, and that is that a long time ago, in 1997, the first of these water privatizations led by the World Bank or forced by the World Bank was done to the little country of Bolivia. It's a landlocked South American country. 85% indigenous people, very poor, and people there keep their culture, keep their beliefs and their traditions and so on, and they've had wave after wave of colonialism and so on. Well, they sought help from the World Bank, said we need money for water services. So the World Bank said, okay, but you're going to privatize. And not only are you going to privatize, but we're going to choose the company and we'll sign the agreement and it's none of your business what happens. So they picked Bechtel, which was a engineering company whose motto at the time was, we paved the world, which is really awful. So this company comes in, they don't know what they're doing. They set up a private water company and they double and then triple the price of water. And so people simply cannot pay for the water coming out of their taps. And then they say, oh, and by the way, we own the water coming out of the sky. We own the rain. And so we have inspectors. If you're caught capturing that water, keeping that water, you will be fined. And people went to jail for capturing water. So there was a revolution, an uprising. A man named Oscar Oliveira, who was a shoemaker, who'd never traveled outside of Cochabamba before, led this revolution against this mighty company and their government and the World Bank. And the troops were brought out into the street. People were killed. I mean, it was a real water war, one of the first of the water wars. But we won. And Bechtel was forced to leave, and the World Bank was forced to back off. And then they elected Evo Morales, their first indigenous leader, who then kicked a sister company out of the capital. So it was a huge victory. And I remember saying to Oscar Oliveira, tell me, where did you get the courage to do this? Because you were up against guns, you didn't have any of that kind of ammunition on your side, and why water? And he said, because I would rather die of a bullet than thirst. And I've always remembered that, because there are people dying every day, if not of thirst, and of filthy water. And I tell you that because the first time I went to the tar sands in Alberta, took a bus, a group of us, and went up, brought some reporters with us, and really took a look at close range. Lovely people working there. I mean, good people who are building community and so on, but they're living and working in a very difficult industry. You stand at these enormous, they look like lakes, and they're just pure poison. It's just the tailings pond from these sites, because it's a mining operation. And they have to keep something going that sounds like a gunshot every couple of seconds, because the birds fly over, they'll land, right? And die. So it was an amazing experience. And if any of you ever have a chance to go there, I would strongly suggest you do so. We went back to Edmonton, we held a press conference, and a young man named Mike Mercredi, who's from the Cree First Nation there, said in the press conference, my people are dying. Babies are being born with duct cancer, and we can't drink the water, we can't eat the animals, we can't fish. All our water is bottled water brought in. It's destroyed not only our way of life, but our health. And then he said, and the reason I tell you this is that it reminded me of what Oscar Oliveira had said. He said it would be kinder if you came in with guns than what you're doing now. He said every night we can see it getting closer and closer and closer. And of course, the plans for expansion in the tar sands, if that pipeline is allowed to go ahead, are huge. So I share this with you because really it is a matter of life and death. And right now, it's not a matter of life and death here, because we have, you are the biggest city in Canada to depend totally on your groundwater. But as your community grows and as the demands increase, and you're going to find more companies like the one you just defeated coming here, and you're going to find under this government, I think, we're going to have a whole bunch of new fights around, come here, we're open for business. That's one of the first things Doug Ford said. So we really need to understand that with time, think of a planet with 7 billion people without adequate access to water. We really do have to get our heads around this. If we do it right, I think that water could become nature's gift to teach us how to step more lightly on this planet and live in harmony with one another. But we have a lot of work to do. Thank you so much.